The town laughed when she bought the burned barn, but among the ashes, she found the impossible. That's what they said afterward in Jalisco. But first, let us tell you the story from the beginning. Welcome to the Stories Between Lives channel. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and comment from what part of Mexico or from where you're watching us, because there are thousands of people listening to this story alongside you at this very moment. When Esperanza Ruelas signed the papers for the burned barn, 3 men who were at the notary's office laughed out loud. They didn't try to hide it. The notary himself had to lower his face so that she wouldn't see his smile. The barn on the old road had been in ashes for 2 years. Nobody wanted it. They had appraised it at what bare land is worth when it doesn't even have soil anymore. Only soot and ruin, and the smell of burned wood that doesn't go away even with a whole year of rain. And there was Esperanza Ruelas, 43 years old, widowed for 8 months, with 3 children and a sack of debts, signing as if she knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't know. Or she did know. But in a way that isn't explained with words, but with the hands. The story of why Esperanza bought that barn began the same week they buried her husband, Gilberto. Gilberto Ruelas had died of a fever that came quickly and left quickly and took him with it. He left 3 children, Tomas, 12 years old, the girl Lupe, 9, and little Beto, who was barely 4 and still asked for his papa when dawn came. He also left a debt with his brother-in-law Aurelio Perez, Gilberto's older brother, who showed up at the house 8 days after the burial with a paper written by hand saying that Gilberto had owed him money for 3 years and that the house where the family lived was the guarantee for that debt. Esperanza read the paper. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper carefully and gave it back to Aurelio. "Give me 15 days, she said. "You have 10, answered Aurelio. And he left without taking the coffee she had set on the table for him. What Aurelio didn't know, and what no one in the town knew, was that Gilberto had told Esperanza something on the last night he could speak, when the fever already had him almost without a voice, but still with his eyes open. He had said, "The barn on the old road, Esperanza. Look under the hearthstone. What is there is yours." She hadn't completely understood because Gilberto was delirious at times and spoke of things that had no thread. But those words had been engraved in her like things get engraved that one hears in the moment when there is the most silence inside. On the 3rd day of widowhood, Esperanza went to the barn. She walked alone along the dirt road, with her rebozo wrapped tight and her sandals raising fine dust. It was November, and the cold of Jalisco comes down from the hill without warning. The barn was at the back of an abandoned Biumeran lot surrounded by huizache and magueys that no one had planted there, but that had come on their own. The adobe walls were still standing, but blackened halfway up. The roof had fallen inside. Where the main hearth had been, there were only mixed-up stones and a thick layer of gray ash. Esperanza entered. She smelled the soot. She smelled the old burned wood. She smelled something else she couldn't name at that moment. She knelt next to the hearthstones and began to move them one by one. The 5th stone felt different. It wasn't bigger than the others, but when she lifted it, the ground sounded different, hollow. Esperanza scraped away the ash with her fingers. She found an old wooden board, rotten at the edges, but whole in the center. She lifted it. Beneath was a clay pot covered with a piece of woven palm tied with twine. Esperanza didn't open it there. She wrapped it in her rebozo, carried it against her chest, and walked back to the town with the same calm with which she had arrived, as if she carried something that was already hers from before finding it. That night, when her 3 children were asleep, she opened the pot on the kitchen table. Inside there was a small notebook wrapped in cotton cloth, a rosary of dark silver, and under the notebook, carefully folded, 3 papers with notary letterhead that Esperanza read slowly, twice each, until she understood what they said. The barn on the old road had belonged to Gilberto's grandfather. It had passed to Gilberto's father. And when the father died, it had been left unregistered because the brothers never came to an agreement. But there was a will, signed, with 2 witnesses with first and last names. And in that will the barn was Gilberto Ruelas's, and now his widow and children's. Esperanza folded the papers, put them back in the clay pot, and placed the pot in the center of the table. "God willing," she said in a low voice, alone in that kitchen. The next day she went to the notary's office and bought the barn. Not with money she had, but with the little Gilberto had saved in a coffee can inside the wardrobe, which Esperanza had not touched since the burial. She paid what bare land was worth because no one knew that the land had more than soot. And the 3 men laughed, and the notary lowered his face. She signed and left. What none of those who laughed knew then was that the notebook wrapped in cotton cloth held something that was going to change everything they believed they knew about that burned plot. 4 days passed before Esperanza returned to the barn. This time she didn't go alone. She went with Tomas, the oldest son, who carried a shovel and a bucket and the face of a boy who doesn't ask questions when his mother walks with that kind of determination. Doña Refugio Mendez also went, neighbor of a lifetime, and her husband Don Porfirio, who was a retired bricklayer and who had said, without anyone asking him, that if Esperanza needed hands, his were there. They entered the barn. Don Porfirio walked slowly through the interior, looking at the walls, tapping the adobe with his knuckles, measuring with his steps. Esperanza let him do it. Then Don Porfirio stood in the center and said, "The walls are good. The adobe that's still standing will hold. Only the roof and the floor need work." "How much time?" asked Esperanza. "With help, a month? Without help?" Don Porfirio looked at her. "Without help it can't be done, Señora." "With help, then," said Esperanza. That afternoon, Doña Refugio went from house to house along the main street telling what Esperanza was doing. She didn't tell it as gossip. She told it like someone giving notice, with the same calm voice with which one announces that tomorrow it's going to rain. And the next day, there appeared at the barn 2 boys from the upper neighborhood who didn't know each other, but who arrived at almost the same time. A middle-aged man named Crisanto, who had worked as a builder in the north and who had returned to the town without work and with his hands still knowing what they knew. And Señora Amparo Vidal, who arrived with a basket of tamales wrapped in an embroidered napkin and said that to work one has to eat, and that at least she could provide that every day it was needed. That's how it began. Tomas worked alongside Don Porfirio every morning before school and entire afternoons on Saturdays. He learned to mix mud for the adobe with a seriousness his father would have recognized. He also learned to recognize when a wall was level without using a plumb line, putting his palm flat and closing one eye, just like Don Porfirio. Lupe carried water from the trough on the road with a bucket that weighed more than it should have weighed for a 9-year-old girl, but that she never left half-finished on the ground. Lupe didn't complain. She had the same closed mouth as her mother when there is work to be done. Little Beto stayed with Doña Refugio and asked less about his papa. Because on the days when there was a lot of movement and people coming and going from the lot, something in him seemed to understand that life went on, even though he didn't yet know how. Esperanza worked from dawn until dark. She cleaned soot, arranged stones, swept ash, carried boards. She had cracked hands before the first week. Gilberto's hands had also been like that. cracked and calloused. And sometimes when she arranged a stone with both flat palms, she thought about that without saying it. One of those mornings, while scraping the soot from the east wall, she found something beneath the black layer. At first she thought they were marks from the fire. She passed a damp cloth, and the marks became clearer. They were letters, carved in the adobe with some pointed instrument, letter by letter, with the same patience with which someone carves something they want to last. They were dates, names, a kind of record. Crisanto, who was passing by with a load of boards, stopped to look. "They're harvest marks," he said. "My grandfather did the same thing. Every year they filled the barn, they marked the date and how many loads went in." Esperanza ran her fingers over the letters. There were records of 30 years or more. Names she didn't recognize at first, and then she did. Ruelas. Gilberto's surname appeared 3 times on different dates. "This barn held a lot of corn," said Esperanza in a low voice. "It's going to hold more," said Crisanto, and kept walking with his boards. What Esperanza didn't know yet was that the cotton cloth notebook she kept in the clay pot had inside it something more than recipes and lists. It had a loose sheet, folded in 3, with handwriting that was not Gilberto's, but that of someone older, with the round and patient calligraphy of someone who learned to write when writing was a serious matter. She found it one night, going through the notebook by the light of the oil lamp. The sheet spoke about the barn. It described the land in Varas, named the Boundaries. Mentioned a spring that, according to the text, rose at the northeast corner of the property, beneath an old cypress, and that in good years gave enough to irrigate half a hectare of cornfield. Esperanza read that 3 times. The next day, she went to the northeast corner of the property before anyone arrived. She looked for the cypress. It was there, only half burned, with the trunk black on one side and the branches alive on the other. Esperanza knelt at the foot of the trunk and put her palm on the ground. Damp, in November, without recent rain. She stayed kneeling a moment with her eyes closed. "Gilberto," she murmured, "what did you leave me?" Aurelio Perez appeared on a Tuesday. 3 weeks after Esperanza had bought the barn, he arrived with the same handwritten paper and with a man who said he was a lawyer. Although the man spoke little and watched a lot and didn't seem very sure of either of the 2 things. They arrived at noon. At the barn were Crisanto, Don Porfirio, the 2 boys from the upper neighborhood, Tomas, Doña Refugio, and Señora Amparo, who that day had brought beans from the pot in addition to the tamales, because according to her, people who work need to eat twice. Aurelio entered the property and stopped. He didn't expect to see what he saw. The barn was half rebuilt, but you could see what it was going to be. The walls clean, the floor new on one half. The roof beams already placed in the east section. People working without hurry, but without stopping. He looked at Esperanza, who was carrying a sack of lime with Tomas. "Esperanza," he said, "the paper that Gilberto signed is valid. The debt exists." Esperanza put the sack on the ground. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Good morning, Aurelio." "The debt exists," he repeated. Crisanto, from where he was, without stopping working, said in a normal voice, "The barn has a will of ownership with 2 signed witnesses. If Don Gilberto's debt was real, the path is the civil court, not pressure." He paused. "The delegate has had a copy of the will since last week." Aurelio looked at Crisanto. "You are not a lawyer." "No," said Crisanto, "but I know how to read. And the gentleman who came with you also knows how. And he's already reading the face of the matter." The man who had come with Aurelio was looking at the barn. He was looking at the walls. He was looking at the people. and he had the face of someone who already knows how this ends. Aurelio turned to Esperanza. You signed that debt too. You were the guarantor. Esperanza looked at him a moment. Then she said, in a voice that didn't go up or down, Aurelio, Gilberto was your brother, and I buried him. And these are his children. She pointed to Tomas, who was standing next to her without speaking. If you have a real debt to collect, go to the court. Here I'm not going to sign anything more. Silence. Doña Refugio, from the back of the barn, began to serve beans onto the plates as if the conversation were already over. Aurelio Perez looked at Esperanza. He looked at Tomas. He looked at the man he had brought, who by this point was already putting away his papers. He looked at the barn that was ceasing to be ruins. Then he looked at the ground. Gilberto was stubborn, he said finally, in a low voice, without venom, just as a fact. Yes, said Esperanza. So am I. Aurelio turned around. The man followed him. They went down the dirt road without hurry and without looking back. Don Porfirio watched them leave and then bent down to keep arranging a beam as if nothing had happened. The boys from the upper neighborhood looked at each other and went back to work. Tomas stayed standing next to his mother a moment, then grabbed the sack of lime they had left on the ground and carried it alone to where it was needed. Esperanza watched him carry that sack, and something in her chest stopped hurting. By the time spring arrived, the barn on the old road had a new roof of beams and tile, a floor of packed earth, and a wooden door with hinges that Don Porfirio had found in the rubble of another construction and had restored with the patience of a man who knows that good things are not thrown away. The harvest marks on the east wall remained clean and visible. 30 years of dates and names that the soot had covered and that Tomas had discovered scraping with a damp cloth one entire afternoon. Someone from the town who came to see asked if they were going to paint over them. Esperanza said no. That those marks were the history of the place, and that history is not painted over. It's cared for. In the northeast corner of the property, beneath the cypress that was still half black and half alive, they had opened a shallow well with help from Crisanto and from 2 men from the ejido below who came when word got around that there was water. The water was little but constant, enough for a garden. Esperanza planted chile, tomato, aromatic herbs. She also planted corn in a narrow strip along the south wall, more to honor the harvest marks engraved in the adobe than because she believed much would come of it. Much came of it. On Sundays, the barn filled in a different way. Doña Refugio brought atole. Señora Amparo brought whatever there was. Crisanto stayed to chat until it got dark. The children of other neighbors played with Lupe and little Beto in the patio of the property, while the older ones talked about everyday things, which are the things that matter most. The clay pot was in a corner of the barn, on a shelf that Tomas had built with leftover boards. Esperanza had put it there deliberately, in plain sight, the way one places something that deserves to be seen. The notebook was still inside. The dark silver rosary, too. The papers of the will she kept in an envelope folded inside her blouse, near her chest, when she went out for any errand. One afternoon in May, when the sun was still warm and the smell of wet earth was rising from the garden, Crisanto sat next to Esperanza on the corridor of the barn and said to her, "Did you know what was here when you bought it?" "I knew that Gilberto had told me something on the last night." "And if there had been nothing?" Esperanza thought a moment. "I would have bought it anyway. I couldn't stay where Aurelio was going to arrive with papers." Crisanto nodded slowly. He looked at the cypress in the corner. "The town laughed," he said. "The town laughs at what it doesn't understand," said Esperanza. "It's not the town's fault. It's not my fault either." Crisanto didn't respond. There was a half-moon coming out over the hill, and the hens that Lupe had gotten who knows how were already put away in their corner, and the whole property smelled of earth that had drunk water and was resting. Gilberto was clever, said Crisanto finally. Gilberto was honest, said Esperanza, which is different and is better. Sometimes the most desperate moments are the beginning of something that doesn't yet have a name. And the only thing needed to find it is not to let go of the last thing that remains, which sometimes is the voice of someone who is no longer there, but who spoke at the exact moment. Esperanza didn't buy that burned barn because she knew what was inside. She bought it because it was the only thing that belonged to her and because her children were watching. And when the children are watching, a mother cannot afford the luxury of giving up. Have you ever had to let go of something you loved in order to receive what you needed? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below. Tell us from what part of Mexico or of the world you're listening to us. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any story. Share it with someone who needs to hear that ashes sometimes hold what fire could not destroy. Until the next story, a hug from heart to heart. And they say in that town in Jalisco that Tomas Ruelas, the oldest son, still engraves the harvests on the wall of the barn, date by date, load by load, like the grandparents did, like those who come will keep doing.